Okay, I've got top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know there's a lot of people who are in the process of joining. Um, so I'll just spend a couple of minutes introducing the concept of these sessions for those of you who are new. I know there's a lot of you who haven't been to a forum event in the past. Welcome. Again, my name is Anthony Adorno. I'm with DeGarmo, and we sponsor these events. We're excited to have you with us. So for those of you who haven't been here before, we host these events on a bi-monthly basis, really as an opportunity to continue to support your professional development. We welcome speakers from other OPOs, outside speakers such as Nika, who you'll hear from today, really in an effort to share tips, strategies, best practices on things relevant to your role as FSCs. We're hoping that these events provide an opportunity for you guys to grow your network, develop more relationships in the OPO community. Ultimately, our overarching goal is to try to save as many lives as possible. So we've gotten really great feedback on these events throughout 2024. I think the first event that we hosted back in January had 75 people. I think this one is around 225. So they've gotten more popular over time. I think it's because of really good content and presenters such as Nika, who we're excited to welcome back for her encore session. So if you didn't catch part one of Nika's presentation, feel free to reach out to me after the session or as part of the post-session survey and request a link to view that session on demand. We'll gladly send it over to you. So before we get started, just a reminder, we do our best to really try to balance how much time we spend presenting material that we think is insightful and useful and valuable in some ways, with your opportunity to engage with the speakers and ask questions that you'd like to have answered. And so it's a challenge to find that sweet spot. I think we're going to have about 10 minutes at the end of Nika's presentation for Q&A. So if you do have things that you'd like for Nika to address, please use the Q&A dialog box that's part of your attendee panel and put in your questions at any point in time. So we'll accumulate those questions throughout the course of the session, and then during that 10-minute Q&A, we'll find the most relevant questions for the broader audience and present those to her to respond to. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nika Short, who is the Director of Behavioral Health at Seattle Roots Community Health, and she has spent the last 8 years working with donor families and the staff who support those family conversations. She says it's an honor and a privilege to do this incredible work and to support the team members who are committed to working with families during some of the most difficult times of their life. Her passion is creating the best possible environment for these hard conversations, making sure that donation staff are set up for success, and helping to make these roles sustainable so that the amazing people drawn to this kind of work can continue to grow in their knowledge and experience and ultimately help more families in the future. Nika has a 6-year-old daughter, so she spends time with her on the weekends. She also enjoys going on long runs. She just shared with me that she just finished a race very recently, and she also likes going to drag shows. So without further ado, Nika.
Thanks so much, Anthony. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk about the topic that we're going to talk about today, and excited for your questions too. I'm also always available for follow-up if we don't get a chance to answer all the questions during the session, because I know there isn't as much time for conversation as there could be. Like Anthony shared, I became increasingly passionate over my 8 years working with donor families about creating really resilient staff, roles, departments who do this work, because as we know, this is some of the hardest and most amazing work out there. And that's something I share at the beginning of any presentation about donation conversations. I think there is nothing else in the world like this job. And that is twofold. There is nothing that has as much difficult and challenging content. There's also nothing as amazing as being the person who's talking to families during this time of life and offering them something that can potentially help them in their grief down the road. So the topic that we're going to talk about today really speaks to all of that. It's the ethics of resiliency, personal resiliency, and resiliency on the level of sort of how we all show up when we're in those conversations and then what we do afterwards. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. And I'm going to assume that's working unless I hear otherwise. So I'm a marriage and family therapist. I was practicing as a therapist for a while before I started working in donation. And I found once I entered into the world of donation, I found just an incredible amount of gratification in doing the work of speaking with families and then working with staff also who are speaking with families. I also found that the particular combination of an on-call schedule and really difficult content during my work day or work week was a recipe for fatigue and potential burnout. And so this became a real passion of mine because I also saw that the most incredible people ever were the ones who were drawn to do this work. And I really wanted them to keep doing this work and keep showing up for families. So when we're thinking about self-care, I think, self-care gets a sort of trivial reputation around like, is it just pedicures? Is it just a massage? I think one of the ways I like to center this conversation is to just consider that actually self-care is included in all of the major ethical codes in mental health professions. So this one's the social work one. I could have pulled any of them. This one says professional self-care is paramount for competent and ethical social work practice. Professional demands, challenging workplace climates, and exposure to trauma warrant that social workers maintain personal and professional health, safety, and integrity. I know we're not all social workers. I know lots of different roles fill this family support position. And yet, all of those things apply to everyone who's talking to families and hospital staff for that matter, right? Challenging workplace climates, professional demands, exposure to trauma. And I think that is a really good groundwork for why self-care is way more than a pedicure. It's really at the core of what allows us to continue doing this work. This is a little review of what I talked about in the first session, and also happy to answer questions about this at any point. One of the things that really dictates how our resiliency looks long-term is what nervous system state we're in and how flexible our nervous system is at moving between these different nervous system states. So this is polyvagal theory, the idea that your nervous system has three main states and that the healthiest nervous system is able to navigate through, especially the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, that ventral vagal state, really fluidly. You're able to become a little activated. That might happen even if you're just a little stressed out or if you're exercising, but then you're also able to get back to that social or engagement nervous system state, which is that state of rest where you're able to be generous, you're able to have access to humor, real rest in your body. And ideally, we're moving between those two nervous system states all the time. The dorsal vagal is a little different. That's the sort of full shutdown state where usually it occurs when you feel your life is threatened in some way. And that nervous system state can take a little longer to get out of, to regulate out of. But if we are in a state of arousal or hyperarousal, either the sympathetic nervous system state, which is that fight or flight, or the dorsal vagal state, routinely. This is like someone who has a trauma history or especially childhood trauma. If we're in one of those states routinely, it can become very hard for our body to access the parasympathetic state and to re-regulate. And as you can imagine, that can lead to burnout, fatigue, and actual physical symptoms. Whenever anybody says, oh, that's just stress, I'm like, oh, stress can kill you and also cause any number of physical symptoms. So when we're thinking about polyvagal theory and then trauma combined, and we're thinking about ourselves as clinicians, as practitioners in this work, this can be a really helpful framework because we know from polyvagal theory, individuals who have a trauma history are more likely to have difficulty traveling between, sort of fluidly moving between those nervous system states. That might be someone who has childhood trauma, or it might be someone who has repeated secondary trauma from their workplace, right? So we are in a role, you all are doing this amazing role that also has high potential for secondary trauma, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So for healthcare workers, we actually can become one of those individuals who has a hard time going between the ventral vagal, the sort of relaxed rest and digest, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So for healthcare workers, we actually can become one of those individuals who has a hard time going between the ventral vagal, the sort of relaxed rest and digest nervous system state, and the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight state, because we've become so activated, so hyper-aroused over and over and over, even just at the work in our workplace, that it's very hard for us to get back to that place of rest. So there are a lot of terms, right? Clinician burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. I think burnout was sort of first coined at this 1975 time. And it is sort of a progressive concept. Like first you experience some emotional exhaustion, then you sort of lose the personalization of the job, sort of harder to feel empathy, harder to feel caring and compassion. And then there's this feeling of a real decreased sense of accomplishment. And that is sort of the stage where you can really end up in a burnout where you can't continue in a role. These are the symptoms. So the symptoms are physical, they're physiological, they're emotional, that deep exhaustion, depression, anxiety. I mean, all of these symptoms are serious to varying degrees, and all of them can really impact our quality of life and our ability to enjoy our time both at work and away from work. And some of them can lead to really severe health issues down the road. I think an important part of burnout for this group, for this kind of work, is that idea of vicarious traumatization. So when we're thinking about the distress to burnout continuum, for someone who might have a lot of distress from being at work, but is not necessarily exposed to really high trauma situations with individuals or families, they probably would have an easier time staying on that distress end of the scale rather than the burnout end of the scale. And in speaking with families, as you know, we have both the really challenging work environment, challenging content, and potential exposure to individuals who are in trauma, to stories about trauma, to reading chart notes that contain information about trauma. And so that can actually lead to the individuals doing that work having a shared experience with the people who are experiencing the trauma firsthand. And that's how vicarious trauma can really impact our ability to do this work sustainably. The symptoms are very similar to the symptoms of burnout because it's part of that package, but it also can include things like addictive and compulsive behaviors. It might be intrusive thoughts that are not necessarily something that you witnessed, but that you heard about. I think probably everyone can relate to like that one story or that one case or a couple that really stuck with you. It could be an avoidant response, right? I had a tough situation at work at the beginning of last year, and I noticed the next day I was driving to work and I like physically, my body wanted to turn the car around and go home. I did not want. It was avoidant response to driving to work and parking my car. And so just noticing like, are these things that are coming up for you, and how do you sort of categorize those into, oh, this is maybe because of a specific event, this might be a cumulative effect, and then what do I do next? So as opposed to the sort of trivial concept of self-care, I actually think self-care is selfless, and it is essential to doing this work ethically and responsibly long term. I think you might have heard some of these concepts. I feel like they're being talked about quite a bit right now. I really like the idea of, either we're observing or absorbing. And that's definitely a spectrum as well. Like I can think of times that I worked with families where I did just pick up a lot of their experience, energy, feelings. And then other times where I felt like I could really observe and not take with me the actual feelings or experience that the family was having. And similarly, are you caring or are you carrying what they're sharing with you away? And so I think these can just be good reminders when you're sitting in those really difficult situations. How much of this am I taking on? How much of this am I taking with me? So when we think about self-care, I think about it on a macro level and then on a micro level. And I would say, macro is preventative as well as treating the symptoms of fatigue or burnout. And then micro are the things you can do in the moment, really anywhere you are, that will improve the potential for you to be regulated and in that regulated nervous system state. So macro self-care, we are talking truly macro: sleep, exercise, food, therapy, physical health maintenance, things like using your days off, taking recovery time after a difficult case, stepping away from email, being aware of your substance use, building healthy relationships, having supportive community around you, maybe creativity or self-expression or spirituality. I really like there's a whole column for treats, like celebrations, little pleasures, things that bring you joy in the moment, gratitude, a gratitude practice, and then play, like making time to play a sport, play with a kid, play with, your pets. All of these things really help ensure that if you're doing those regularly, when you show up to a difficult situation, the chances are better that you're going to be able to be in a regulated nervous system state. A big piece of your nervous system lives in your gut. So I think food should maybe get its own category. And I think this role in particular sets you up to have a really hard time feeding yourself consistently, right? So many cases. I got off at 10 o'clock at night. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since 8 o'clock that morning. I was so hungry. I ate a giant plate of French fries and a pizza, right? And the next morning I have to go back. I know I'm not going to feel good, but I haven't been feeding myself. And so I know my system is craving all those foods that are not bad foods, but they are delicious and they're not necessarily going to make me feel the best. So when we're thinking about our nervous system living in our gut, right, that is a real indicator of how important it is to feed ourselves well, to feed ourselves regularly. If you think about some of the concepts around like intermittent fasting, that feeling you get when you're really hungry for a period of time is telling your body something. That tells your nervous system something, that you're in some form of danger, right? And so you think about what that does to your adrenaline, what that does to your emotions, what that does to your ability to regulate. It can be really challenging. So I would say if I had to distill it down, protein every 3 hours, get as much sleep as you can, even when it's hard because you're on call. Get your labs done, right? Like when it says healthcare, there are potential things that could be found in your actual lab work, like low vitamin D or, low iron that could be affecting whether your body is able to regulate, that if you just knew would be really treatable. Use your time off and then find things that bring you joy. So that's sort of the macro, I would say, too long didn't read version. When we're thinking about micro self-care, I am not going to read all of these, but I will send you the presentation. When we're thinking about micro self-care, we are thinking about those little things you can do, I would say, before you go in to talk to a family. So my version of this is a breathing exercise. I breathe for 5.5 seconds in, I breathe for 5.5 seconds out. I time it on my phone. I do it before I go into a hard conversation, before I give a presentation. If somebody's calling me and I'm worried about the phone call, I take at least one of those breaths in and out before I answer the phone. So anything you can do in the moment, if you can't leave the hospital, some of these you can still do. If you can leave the hospital, that might mean going for a brief walk, getting a warm cup of tea or coffee, but not too much coffee, using your senses. All of this is a mindfulness practice. I recently was listening to an audiobook and they said very clearly, you will not clear trauma without a mindfulness practice. And I was like, oh, that is very clear, right? Like this is the way that we heal trauma, whether it's vicarious trauma or our own personal trauma. And we're all showing up to work with our own personal experience as well, of course, right? So these are some examples. A lot of times, micro self-care has to be personal. It has to be what works for you. I got these from positive psychology. Some of them work for me, some of them don't, right? Like if I was in the hospital and I was hugging myself, perhaps like the green example, I would I might actually activate my nervous system. I don't think that it would help relax me. But some of them might work and different ones will work for different people. So when we're thinking about micro self-care, one important thing to remember is that this is not a quick fix, right? You can't just be like, oh, I think I'm dysregulated. I'm going to breathe and things will automatically turn around. Really, there is no quick fix. All you can do is know yourself as well as possible and know what works for you as much as possible. Do the preventative work ahead of time. So the chances that when you get dysregulated, it will be as easy as possible to get yourself back to a regulated nervous system space. I put together these quick tricks on the side. They're the ones that work really well for me, and you're welcome to take them or not. Take or leave them. One of the ones that top one look at what's moving. I now have done that enough times as a mindfulness practice that when I go outside, I automatically find myself looking around for what's either blowing in the wind or a bird and just my mind automatically goes to that. And that's the way our brains work, right? If we do something and we do it over and over, our brain will start to build that into our pattern, build that into our routine. So I like that one. I like the listen for the furthest sound. It gives us something to focus on that's outside of us, and that sort of helps our mind, right? Anytime you tell someone, well, just meditate, just clear your mind, that doesn't always feel accessible. But if you have a thing to focus on that helps you achieve that mindfulness, you can do this while you're doing the dishes. You can do it while you're walking. You can do it in a hospital room. There's lots of sounds, right? And you can sort of train your mind to try to access what's the furthest sound. Also hugging an animal or a person, right? That's the co-regulation piece that I talked about in the first session. being close to someone, being close to a pet is one of our quickest access points to nervous system regulation. Unfortunately, for me, who has a really hard time resting, you have to. I have a tendency to schedule things back to back, to go, go, go. I just was on a call where people were asking, like, how do you stay active on the weekends? And I was like, oh, I have no problem with that. I don't know how to stop. So not only do we need rest, we need all of these different kinds of rest. And at some point, we'll probably need each of these different kinds in different amounts. So we actually do need physical rest where we're lying down. Our brain needs a break from thinking about things. We need emotional rest where we're not activated in an emotional way. This can be why if you have a lot going on at home, right, emotionally, and you have a lot going on at work because you work with donor families, things can feel really challenging because you're not getting a break when you're at home. I remember when I had my kid, I was like, oh, home is so stressful. All of a sudden, it just went from home feeling like the place where I rest to I go to work and I'm like, oh, there's no babies are yelling at me. This is great. But when you have high stress in more than one area of your life, it can be really hard to get that mental and emotional rest. Creative rest. We need time where we're not trying to do anything, invent anything, create anything, make art, where we just get a chance to take a break. Spiritual rest, in the same way that you might have access to a spiritual self-care practice, whether you're religious or not, we all deserve rest in these areas. And then sensory, if you are overwhelmed by sensory input, at both work, right? Because you work in an ICU and then you go home and things are really loud or things are happening really fast or there's a lot of bright lights or perhaps somebody's yelling at you all the time to make them food. That can be an opportunity to really specifically identify like, oh, I need to go sit in a dark room. How can I get some support so that I can get some sensory rest? And then social rest, like we all need interaction with other people. I had a deal with my partner that once I came home from a case, I got 5 hours just to not talk to anybody, which like I recognize that's a luxury that not everyone has access to. But I knew if I did interact with people socially during those 5 hours, it probably wasn't going to go well. And I really needed some actual space to myself. I think when we're thinking about the kind of rest that we need, the ability to tune in to our body, which is that interoception concept that we talked about in the first session, interoception is really required to have a sense of which kind of rest your body needs. And especially if you have a trauma history or a lot of vicarious trauma, it can be harder to get in touch with your body, right? That interoception might be harder to access. And so really giving yourself time where you're able to drop in to your body and get the best sense possible of what it is that you need in terms of rest. So I think when we're thinking about resiliency as an essential ethical issue, my soapbox is that we sort of all know these people in the healthcare industry that have worked in it forever. They're maybe a little bit crabby, but everybody just knows that that's the way that they are and that that's what we can expect. And that might lead to a little bit less compassion with patients, maybe compassion with our coworkers, colleagues. I think this can come up in our healthcare conversations and interactions just as much as our family interactions. I know I ran into these people both in the OPO world and in the hospital partners that we worked with. And I think accepting a level of burnout or vicarious trauma that's really impacting someone's ability to show up and do their job is not a good idea, right? For the care of our patients and for the care of ourselves. And I think when we are able to see resiliency as far less trivial, not only is this not a pedicure issue, it is an essential issue that is really plaguing healthcare. And the responsibility falls on the system and on the individual. And how do we make sure that as individuals, we are showing up and we're able to be present? I think that the idea of caring versus carrying is a really eloquent way to think about it, because we don't want to show up and be numb, right? That's part of burnout. That's part of vicarious trauma, is that you can't feel empathetic toward the people that you're working with. So it's not like there's a fix for this that is just not feeling. You have to be able to show up and feel and have empathy and feel what the family is feeling in order for them to know that you're present. And then we have to be able to let it go and move on to the next potentially really difficult case or family. Um, Research really shows that the state of the clinician's well-being is vital to performance. So I think this is something I bring up every time there is any kind of conflict around giving people time off or changing the way a role is structured to make things more sustainable. Like, what we want is the best possible performance. And the way that we can make sure that happens is that we really implore people to take care of themselves, and we make sure that we're taking really good care of our people. I think, especially when we're working with families, especially when we're talking about donation, we want all of those conversations to go as well as humanly possible. And as Anthony shared at the beginning, I really found that the way that I showed up made a huge impact on how that conversation went, even if it didn't mean the outcome was different necessarily. It made an impact on how well that family was able to hear the information that I shared with them. So if I showed up and I was really anxious, the family didn't necessarily say no to donation because of my anxiety, but a lot of times I didn't even get to share all of the information I had to share with them about donation, or I didn't feel like we got to a place where I could share that information while they were in a calm nervous system state and could really hear it. And so one of the things that I shared about last time, and I will just say again, because I think it's a good trick, if there was a trick, is when you're going into a family conversation, you can use some of that time to help regulate your own nervous system and therefore co-regulate the family's nervous system. And that really is that window of time before you bring up donation, when you are making a connection with the family. And if you're able to make that connection before you bring up donation, if you're able to laugh with the family even, or get them talking about their loved one, or have what feels like a meaningful interaction with them, the chances that then by the time you get to the donation conversation, they're really going to be able to hear that information are much, much higher. So I think, the takeaway is that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's actually essential, and it's an ethical practice when you're in this kind of role. I think failing to take care of yourself, sort of letting yourself get into that burnout state, or in that, oh, I'm just a crotchety old FSD, and I've been doing this for so long that I don't feel anything. That is where we start to get into really dicey ethical territory. And the requirements to keep showing up and to doing that resiliently are that you do this sort of preventative care, of taking care of all of your physical needs, emotional needs, spiritual needs, and also that in the moment you have some really essential tools that can help you regulate. I had folks on my team who listened to YouTube, like inspirational speakers on YouTube, before they went into family conversations. And I was like, again, that probably would put me into fight or flight, but for you, that works, and that's great. Same thing, like some people pray before they go into a conversation. I think that for me, because I know that I really enjoy talking to people, I like the opportunity to get to know someone. A lot of times I was able to really regulate in that beginning part of the conversation because I was just getting to interact with a family and get to know more about them. And then by the time we got to talking about donation, everybody's nervous systems were hopefully in that ventral vagal state. So when we think about, I think this content goes far beyond organ donation, right? Tissue donation. It really is about all of our relationships. It's about our hospital relationships. It's about our coworker relationships. It's about our personal relationships. I think about the times that I know I've gone into a conflict with a loved one in a dysregulated state myself. Then how does that conflict go differently than if I'm able to show up to it and stay really calm? So it isn't just about work, right? And it isn't just about professional relationships. It's about how do we make sure that the chances are the highest that for the difficult conversations and the difficult interactions in our life, we are going to show up, be present, and be able to be our truest selves. I think, shifting from feeling like, oh, self-care is a nice thing if you have the privilege or the luxury to have it, to like, this is actually a really essential piece of the work that I'm doing. Um, I think it also is an essential piece to getting better at this job and to staying in this job long term. I think one of the things that was really common when I started in donation was that we would sort of have people come in, get totally trained up, work for the remainder of the year since they started for whenever they got off orientation, and then leave. And it felt like, we were able to get people so they could complete the job, but we weren't sort of able to get to a place where they could maintain this work, maintain the resiliency of the job. And so I think treating it as an essential part of what it means to be an FSC, to work with families, to be in any kind of role that interacts with people who are in trauma is a really important shift in lens. So I think that is right at the end, and I probably will have a little extra time for questions, which is great. I do think, the shift to the ethical framework is one that I'm curious if people have specific questions about or if that feels intuitive. I think even at the time that I was sort of leaving the organ donation world, although I'll never leave completely, that was a really novel concept. And so I'm curious if people have feedback or thoughts about that.
Thanks, Nika. That's it's really great information. This is, as you kind of opened with, it's often overlooked or trivialized, and there's not enough importance placed on this topic of self-care and being able to take care of yourself before you care for other people. So these tips and these strategies, I think, are invaluable for everyone here in family services roles. So thanks for sharing. There's a couple of things that I'd like you to just talk about a little bit more, explain, just frankly, so I get it at a deeper level. But there's a lot of strategies out there that you suggested, macro, micro, like. At the end of the day, when you're going into a conversation, like what's the one thing like that you would kind of default to make sure that you are in that kind of ideal state to manage that as effectively as possible?
Yeah, well, it's hard to choose just one thing, and I think that's part of what's really complicated about both the sort of parasympathetic nervous system, right? There's a lot of inputs at any given time that can mean that you're either regulated or not regulated. I think if I had to choose one thing, I would go back to that blueberry slide and say it's your gut health, and it's really consistently eating protein. Your brain needs protein every 3 hours. your body is way more likely to stay regulated if you're giving it the calories that it needs. And before I worked in donation, I worked with teenagers, and I had a number of patients over the time that I worked with teens who would come in with like severe depression, anxiety, suicidality. And we would start with an intake and we would talk about what they were eating. And invariably, I would find out they were eating for the first time at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they would have a sandwich at 3 o'clock, and then they'd have dinner with their family, and then that was it. And almost across the board, just adding a protein-filled breakfast turned their depression, anxiety, or suicidality around completely. And it felt like such a clear illustration of how just being fed, just giving your body the calories it needs throughout the day gives you the best possible chance of being regulated. And it's because if our body feels like it's starving, it puts us into fight or flight, right? It truly feels like we are in danger. And so I think especially with this role and how easy it is to not make it to lunch, it means carrying snacks around, carrying high protein snacks around, being really intentional about stepping away when you can, and getting, I have my protein shake here with me. So I'll say I do take my own advice, but it can be really challenging to take those breaks, and finding ways that you can still fuel and still take care of yourself is, I would say, the number one.
Yeah, I think we've all seen those Snickers commercials, the Betty White Snickers commercial. I mean, it's not that a Snickers is probably the best snack for
Sure.
you. Like, protein would be better, but yeah, I mean, it's just it's an incredible difference maker. I think
It's
the other
got
thing
peanuts
that
in there. It's not the worst one.
right, the other thing that I think some people might be grappling with is, in terms of coming up with a routine. One of the ways that we can settle ourselves is having a routine that we follow and that we have comfort in. But the family services job is just regular. There's no, for a lot of people, there's not a lot of set shifts. And to your point, it could be 10 o'clock before you leave the hospital and you haven't eaten. Like how, when you have so much variability in your daily life, how do you kind of maximize these tips and strategies to your advantage when you don't have a really predictable way of managing your day-to-day schedule?
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest challenges of this work. I think that developing a routine for the days that you're on call versus the days that you're off can be really helpful. I love running, as you mentioned, and I went a year as an FSC where I ran every single day. And some of the days it was really hard to figure out when I was going to run. It wasn't very long. I was running at least a mile. So it was,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 10 minutes. One time I did it in a parking garage, and one time of a hospital. People looked at me like I was a little bit out there. One time I did it at the airport. And, I think it really is just fitting in, like at the hotel, if you're staying at hotels, in the fitness center, or getting up and having your protein rich breakfast already with you, so that you know that even if you have to get up and go, you're going to have something to eat. So doing some amount of preparation, or even having a routine for the different places that you'll go, like knowing if I'm at this hospital, this is the restaurant that has the food that is going to make me feel good for the rest of the day, versus something that's maybe going to make me feel like terrible. Or this is what I always order when I go out on a case, so that I sort of have those things built in. Building as much routine as possible, as well as being really flexible. I think that's sort of being able to hold both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I can definitely relate to the running example. I personally can't. My neighbor can. He's like an ultra marathoner, but he's a streak runner who's run every single day for the last 5 years, at least a mile. but that's how he centers himself and relaxes. So I don't know if you've run in a parking garage before, but
Ask him. I would like to know.
Yeah, I'll ask him.
These are also a couple of really good resources, I think. This author, Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, who wrote The Age of Overwhelm, is a local to where I am, Seattle author, who also wrote Trauma Stewardship, which you might be familiar with. And this book is really great in just thinking about how much overwhelm there is in our life and in our worlds currently, and how much information we have access to, and how, if what you're doing is going from this really hard job to then scrolling through terrible news on your phone to then working really hard to take care of your family to then scrolling to then bed, right? The potential that you're going to keep your nervous system in that fight or flight state over and over, or even long term, and have a harder time getting to your parasympathetic ventral vagal calm state is a lot higher. And so how do you sort of create strategies where maybe you have a certain amount of time that you scroll and then you stop, or, there's even apps for that. Same thing with Dopamine Nation. She's, I think, a really incredible scientist and author who talks about, if we are just hitting this easy button for feeling better all the time, right? That might be drugs, alcohol. It might also be scrolling, or anything that gives us sort of a quick fix, gambling, whatever. Then we actually are paying for that in debt. Like, we are going to have to pay for that later. We're getting the dopamine up front, but it creates a come down. It creates a depression later. And if we do the harder things, which might be exercise, meditation, anything that sort of challenges our brain and body, we actually start to create our own dopamine, right? That's how we sort of balance the scales the other way. And so it might not be comfortable to choose running over scrolling, but in actuality, that is going to set your body up better for creating its own good feelings, rather than sort of adding to the pile of depression, anxiety, stress.
Right. Nathan has a question. So it said in your last session, you briefly spoke about cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. So can you define and unpack those a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, cognitive empathy is where you really do understand and can understand exactly, or a lot of how a family member is feeling in front of you, versus giving yourself the full experience of the feelings they are feeling, right? So, if you've ever cried with a family, you're in emotional empathy. If you've ever sat and thought like, oh, I can really imagine how this feels. I can really imagine how it must feel to lose a child. Or, and when we say a lot, I can't imagine how it feels. But if you can cognitively understand what a family might be going through versus going through the exact same experience yourself, it doesn't mean you don't have any of feelings or you're not being fully present in those moments, but the former is going to give you a much higher chance at being able to get up, go about your day, and still do what you need to do, as opposed to really going through the same exact emotional experience that a family that you're working with might be going through.
There's probably some folks on the call who appreciate the information, but maybe don't feel like this is something that probably is really important for them right now. Maybe they're feeling really good about where they are professionally or how they're managing their schedule. I know you talked about burnout and some of the signs. Like, how do you know when it's really time to start prioritizing yourself and taking care of yourself? Like, what do you think of as some of those triggers where, it's like, wait, I should probably stop and maybe rethink how I'm caring for myself? Are there things that stand out to you, like in the normal course of your day, when day-to-day basis you're feeling fine, and then there are things that are happening? Is it, maybe you're not sleeping well, or what are some things that might be um, symptoms or indicators that this is something that should probably be more important than it is for people?
Yeah, well, I think probably the answer to that is last week, yesterday, you should have started doing it, even if you're feeling really good. And I think that is part of the message is like, if you're feeling good, great. That means you're probably doing a lot of these things already. Don't stop. If you're not feeling good, I think one of the biggest indicators is that you're feeling really stressed and tired about going to work, right? If you're having that feeling where you want to turn the car around, if you're feeling a lot less satisfaction, especially in working with families where there's sort of no greater satisfaction in the work that you're doing. I think that there are different indicators for every single person, and that's part of what can be challenging about it. But I think knowing yourself to know what your specific indicators might be. I didn't have trouble with the content of family trauma or conversations. That was something I was able to like sit with and then move on from. It was very rare that something affected me in a bigger way. I really struggle when it came to moral injury. Anytime I was being asked to do something that I didn't believe in or didn't agree with, I would have a lot of feelings come up, and I would know that this is a real recipe for compassion fatigue, for burnout for me. And so knowing that about myself, if I had one of those situations, I could be aware like, oh, I disagreed with my AOC about this thing and I had to go and do it anyway. That's going to be something I need to take care of myself about, or I'm probably going to be extra tired or stressed out and need some extra self-care around that.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about burnout and again, kind of getting, because I know this is just a really important issue in this space. And do you know of any research, or have you personally had anecdotal experience where you can kind of speak to what that time frame looks like? Well, how do you, what, how long is it before you're feeling good to you're burned out and you want something else? Like, does that occur over 2 months, over a year, over 6 months? Like, what? Obviously, it's an individual difference issue, so I know there's going to be variability. But in your experience, or from a research perspective, can you speak to like what that timing is?
Yeah, I don't know the research. I would imagine there's some research all over the board. And I think that in my experience, even in my own nervous system, there isn't one way that it shows up. I think that especially if you're able to watch for the warning signs,
Mm.
if you can stop and take a break or change what you're doing before you get to a place where you need something totally different and it's just not working for you, I think you can actually turn things around pretty quickly. And what I've started to notice is that I actually go sort of in and out of burnout over the course of months or a year quite a few times, right? Like sometimes I'll have a really hard week and I'll notice, ugh, I just don't want to deal with a person, or one of my patients will be coming in and I'll be like, oh God, I don't want to see this person. And then the next week I can be in a very different space. And sometimes that has to do with what I did over the weekend. And sometimes it's sort of an accumulation of like, well, I have been doing these things pretty consistently. And so I actually can weather a small period of burnout without it meaning like I have to change careers or, change something drastic about my life. I think that if you're doing the preventative work, the potential is that you'll probably go through some periods of burnout. Maybe you have a call week where you work with 6 different families, and by the end, have been away from home more than you've been home, and you might just feel like, oh my gosh, I really need a little bit of a break, and I need to be really careful about what my time off looks like during this week. So I think, any preventative work you can do before it gets to a point of no return is meaningful and really powerful. But I also think it's much more fluid than just like, if you're in burnout, you have to quit. and anywhere
Right.
up until then, you're doing great, right? It's really
Yeah.
like, I think we are incredibly resilient people who are able to heal, and even heal while we're continuing to do hard things, do hard jobs. And so it might mean just shifting a little bit of your practice or of your routine and seeing if that helps and seeing if that changes something.
Well, Nika, I want to thank you again for spending your time with this audience and sharing really great information, great tips, great strategies. It's invaluable. I know a lot of people here very much appreciate the time that you've put into preparing and sharing this information with everyone.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great,
Yeah,
and really appreciate a chance to keep a toe in organ donation and see all of your names on the screen. So thank
yeah,
you, Anthony.
right. And so for everyone on the webinar, again, if you weren't able to attend Nika's first presentation, feel free to reach out to me and I can give you a link to watch that on demand. It was really good. And she's graciously made an offer to share the slides with you all, and she shared her information on the screen. So you have access to that if you didn't capture it, or you just want to email me or respond to the meeting invite to request that, feel free to do so. And just a reminder, if you're new to these sessions, after every session, we send out a survey just to get your feedback on your experience here, and equally as important, your suggestions for the content for future sessions that would be helpful for you all. So look out for that in the next hour or so. Please just spend 2 minutes sharing your feedback with us. We really would appreciate it. So until next time, again, thank you for attending. We hope that you found it interesting and helpful. Nika, again, thank you, and everybody enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks.